Welcome to course MSD04 Ecological Economics. The session is today on environmental issues in India with respect to a discussion on common pool resources. Now, what are common pool resources? As you know, a natural or human-made resource system whose size or characteristics of which makes it really costly but not impossible to exclude its potential beneficiaries from obtaining benefits from its use are generally known as common pool resources. So typically they consist of core resources which defines the stock variables while providing a limited quantity of extractable fringe units which defines the flow variables. To keep the resource available for future generation, the core resources are preserved in these common pool resources. So largely CPRs are those resources which are accessible to the whole community, to which no individual has exclusive property right. So that makes more clear how common pool resources or common property resources are. So these are again of two types: common property resources or CPRs and common village land or commons. So resources accessible to and collectively hold, managed or owned by an identifiable community and by which no individual has exclusive property rights are called common property resources, whereas village commons are the categories or CPR that refer to common land resources within the boundary of the village, which are formally, that means either legal sanction or by official assignment, held by village panchayats or community of the village. Now we have to understand that common pool resources are resource characteristics, whereas common property resource is basically a property right regime. And there are diverse natural resources that can be actually categorized into four types based on their relationship between resources and resource users. So these four types are private property resources, second, state property resources, third, open access resources, and fourth, common property resources. So these are four important types. When we talk about history of CPRs, as we call in abbreviation for common property resources, the history of CPR in India is a very diverse and rich history, because traditionally systems of community management were considered under common property resources, especially forest land that existed in different forms in diverse and different parts of the country till the very end of 19th century. A very large part of our country and its natural resources were common properties, in the sense that a wide variety of necessary resources were very freely available to the large rural population existing in the country. The process of extending state control over common resources that began with the declaration of reserved and protected forest, that was very close to the years of closing 19th century, made essentially that there was exclusion of local villagers and their access to common resource by law. What happened? As a result, the systems of community management gradually disintegrated and now virtually almost extinct. While we know that there are certain very good examples of common property resources or community management still existing in many parts of mountain regions of India, especially Uttarakhand, where these community forest reserves or one panchayats are existing. Now again, if I try to segregate the types of common pool resources, there are four important types. 1. Irrigation systems, 2. Fishing grounds, 3. Pastures, and 4. and very important, forests. So the resources falling under this category of CPR in India are protected forest, community forest, village pastures, wastelands, grazing lands. In many parts of India they are also called as gauchar, village ponds, canals, tanks, wells, streams, rivulets, and also riverbeds. So you can see there are a huge number of resources that are categorized under common pool resources. Now in almost all parts of the country, villagers have their legal rights to access some or only some specific categories of land. These are pasture and grazing lands, a larger population in mountain areas, especially in higher Himalayas, communities were traditionally pastoralist communities, and village forest, where a lot of people and rural poor depend for subsistence requirements. And these are under the jurisdiction of village or village panchayats. All other categories of land not under private ownership like barren or uncultivable land, culturable wasteland, put to non-agriculture uses and forest actually belong to state revenue department or forest department. Now rural population, especially the poor, marginalized, depend directly for their diverse subsistence requirements on goods and services that are available from these categories of land. Now we have to understand that besides those and only those resources that are treated as CPRs on which no individual has exclusive property rights, there are systems of customary rights, and these customary rights support traditional practices such as grazing of cattle in the fields after the harvest that represents common rights on private property in many situations. Now when I talk about provisioning ecosystem services, especially in Uttarakhand, we know these forests are giving diverse benefits to community. So right from fuel wood to fodder for livestock to farmyard manure made by leaf litter, and then many type of NTFPs, non-timber forest produces, or wild edibles are extracted from these forests where community have some rights, especially on one panchayats or community forests. Now there was this very interesting book on common property resource management of India, Tanzania and also Zimbabwe by some of the important researchers or economists, Kanchan Chopra, who have really explained better how these policy implications manage common property resources and common pool resource knowledge across the world. There is another book by Dr. Gopal K. Kadaikodi that talks about reflections on theory and the Indian experience of common property resource management. Now when I talk about common property resources and a framework of analysis of natural resource property right regime, we know that there are a bundle of rights that lead to access, withdrawal, management, exclusion and also alienation rights related to these common property resources. Unlike open access resources, in the case of CPR, only the members of concerned group have the right to use and also right to exclude non-members or outsiders. Even the users of authorized use are very much regulated. So a common pool resource can have any of the above 4 property right regimes that I talked about recently. Apart from these, the use of these resources are subtractive and have the characteristic of a public good such as indivisibility. However, there are some exclusive groups as well which have some kind of community rights that ensures that they can utilize, protect and also develop these CPRs. Now, another question that emerges is, and a very important question, who are the actors and what are their roles and responsibilities with reference to common pool resources or common property resources management? Now, first and most important are the government actors who make the policies, then also corporate sector actors who have these rights many times to modify these CPRs for various developmental and profitable goods. Third, most important, non-government or non-profit actors. Last but not the least, the fourth important ones are grassroots or citizen actors. Now, the example of their roles vary from regulation, advocacy, enlightenment, mobilization, coordination, enforcement, arbitration and also collaboration. So there are these diverse actors who have their diverse rights, but it's very important that they work in interactive way and that can ensure effectiveness of their approaches to conserve CPRs across the world and across the country. Now, when I talk about these, we also know that there are different government policies and acts to ensure that these resources are well protected. For forest, you can take the example of Wildlife Protection Act 1972. Another is Environment Protection Act 1986 and also Biological Diversity Act 2002 that ensure conservation of these resources. Now the problems. When we discuss problems of CPRs, it is important to understand that generally subject to the problem of congestion, overuse, pollution and potential destruction unless harvesting or use limits are devised and enforced have been seen very much prevalent across the world. For example, overuse of fisheries can tax the resource and cause the resource deplete. Similarly, overuse of NTFPs, medicinal and aromatic plant subsistence requirements like fuel wood fodder can actually result in overharvesting and depleting of these resources and habitats in the wild. Now, what has happened over the time period that inaccessibility of most of these areas have deprived socioeconomic status of locals across the country. For examples, we know that our forests in the country are already in a very much degraded stage. And if we go for further exploitation in a very unsustainable manner, we know that these resources are going to erode the living standards as well as economic and ecosystem stability of the region. And that's why we need to actually invite more new methodologies and approaches like Red List of Ecosystem to understand the health status of these CPRs. Now, when I come to definition of conceptual root cause, one very important term that some of you or many of you have already heard about is the tragedy of commons, or also called as common pool theory, that is abbreviated as CPT. So, common pool resource or tragedy of common is a class of phenomena that involves a conflict of resources between interests and common goods. The term has originally from a parable publication by William Foster Lloyd in the very 1833 book by him on population. So this was a lecture on the notion of value as a distinguishable not only from utility but also from value in exchange, and it's a very important term. Later, Garrett Hardin, who was an economist, in his essay in 1968 that was entitled as The Tragedy of Commons, focused on 4 important issues. 1. Environmental degradation. 2. Population growth. 3. Limited natural resources. And 4. Privatization of land. Now, this has led to the tragedy of commons, and there are diverse examples that we see in our day-to-day life. 1. Air pollution. 2. Deforestation across the world. Fishing in a very unsustainable manner. Traffic jams that we see because of enhanced usage of vehicles. Littering around, especially plastics in our oceans and sea. Poaching of wildlife. So these are some of the ways we can understand the tragedy of commons because of environmental degradation, population growth, unlimited natural resource exploitation, and privatization of land. Now, it's important to understand that Hardin focused on overbreeding and unnecessary childbirth as the root cause of tragedy of commons. We know that our population is having an exponential growth. As the human population grows, the earth and its resources that are going to be constant. So the rise in population is going to significantly use the resources that are not sufficient to fulfill the demands of our growing population. As each of us focuses more naturally on personal betterment, gains, common resources become and are going to become overloaded and they're going to dwindle. Now, this is very much the concept of tragedy of commons. Now, Hardin also expressed his severe concern about the status, size, and also quality of CPRs in a very seminal paper that was entitled Tragedy of Commons. He advocated that state property regime could actually reduce the overexploitation and degradation of CPRs. He, in his paper, also argued that when property rights, especially to natural resources, are absent or not enforced, that is, when there is open access or free right given to people, there will be over-exploitation of CPRs. And this is what looks like and is the tragedy of commons. Now, here is a very important example of Hardin's call that I relate here with the Paris Agreement and one of the COPs of UNFCCC, that stands for United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So, the Paris Agreement in 2015 was a manifestation of actually Hardin's call, especially for governmental interventions. Despite the progress, it has led to that we are still far from 1.5 degrees centigrade or even 2 degrees centigrade pathway. And even the recently concluded Glasgow COP in 2021 also focuses on the same and says that currently on track of 2.7 degrees centigrade by 2100 according to the latest IPCC report. So that means if we don't take appropriate measures, appropriate governmental interventions, we are not able to stop the increasing temperature and the impacts of climate change on the entire world. Now, common property theories have again been discussed in different ways. First, for example, Hardin's unjustified assumptions, especially his two assumptions said resource users are selfish in nature. The second one was common resources are open access. Now, in both the cases, there might be certain reservations because common property resources are not always open access resources. Now, common property resources are again restricted to a particular group, are also governed by certain set of governmental or non-governmental rules set up by the communities. So, therein is the tragedy. Each man is locked into a system that compels them or compels a particular person to increase his herd without understanding the limit of that system. In a world that is limited, we live in a limited world. So, if we keep increasing the growth of population, ruin is the destination toward which all humanity is rushing, each pursuing their own best interest for the society that believes in freedom of the commons. Freedom in a common brings ruins to the all. So, it has not to be a freedom, but a regulated approach to use the resources in a sustainable manner without compromising the benefits for our forthcoming generation. Now, tragedy of common is also important because it applies to numerous environmental, economic and social phenomena, and it has a very particular relevance, especially as I talked in my previous statements with reference to greenhouse gas emissions. And it's very necessary that an all-inclusive national and international level approach is developed to reduce and regulate greenhouse gases and reduce global warming. Because if we are not able to reduce the impact of tragedy of commons, maybe with reference to climate change, we will have a severe condition waiting for us in the future. Now, I come to an interesting area of this common property resource discussion, and this is about modern commons and modern common related tragedies. For example, the first one is about our total planet Earth. So, exponential growth in population that is leading to overpopulation is a modern tragedy for the planet. Air pollution again is a tragedy to our air environment, and because air is a common good, a common resource for all. So, one degradation at one place is not only going to be limited at that space, is going to have a far ranging impacts on the air environment on this planet. Now water, again, water pollution can be localized, or its unsuitable, unsustainable wastage and overuse may lead to a long lasting impact on water resources and water pollution. So this affects not only the quality but also quantity of water consumption patterns. Soil contamination. We know that soil is again a common property resource, and for the larger good for ensuring nutritional security and benefits of our society. Overuse of chemicals, pesticides, herbicides that are persistent in nature is going to impact the entire world because of persistence of these chemicals. Public spaces and lands, again littering around, crimes, graffiti, this is again a larger tragedy of public spaces and lands. Now when I talk about roads as a public modern common, we know traffic congestion, happening accidents every now and then, and medical and insurance are some of the factors that will, if not appropriately addressed, are going to be the bigger tragedies of modern commons in the present world. Now there are other tragedies as well in this context. For example, energy resources and climate, burning of fossil fuels. We know that burning of fossil fuels, burning of coal is going to have a consequential global warming impact. Enhanced poaching, extinction, wildlife trafficking is going to have a significant impact on wild species of the world. Forest. We already know that forest across the country in natural areas as well as world is very severely depleted and degraded because of deforestation and land degradation. So frontier logging of old growth forests coupled with a lot of other activities like slash and burn are going to have a significant impact on modern forest commons and related tragedies. Overgrazing in public lands, overbuilding, urbanization, urban sprawls, there are these tragedies for modern common like public lands, oceans. Now example of overfishing, reclamation, pollution, especially emerging chemical pollution and microplastics are going to enhance this tragedy of modern bigger commons. So reduced biodiversity is something that will be the bigger tragedy that this world is facing. So you know that now climate change or greenhouse gas emission, biodiversity reduction, these are all related with the kind of tragedies we are imposing on these modern commons and areas. Now, unsurprisingly, Hardin's concept of tragedy of commons and the solution that he proposed faced a lot of criticism from many economists. One and the most important criticism came from Professor Elinor Ostrom, again a Nobel laureate. In particular, she argued that a bottom-up approach to control common pool resources can be a better and effective and a long-term solution to this. She very much emphasized that the individual and the community are capable of managing their collective resources, and the government should need to work with them in order for intervention to be effective in nature. However, her contradictory response to Hardin's essay was very, very relevant in present time. For her analysis of economic governance, especially the commons, fetched her Nobel Prize for Economic Sciences in the year 2009, and it was a very significant recognition to her services. Now, if I want to point to some of the areas about CPR, I would like to point that tragedy is basically a metaphor for what Alfred N. Whitehead called the remorseless working of things. Hardin's aim was to draw attention to problems that cannot be solved by technical means, and this needs change in human values or way we see morality. So there has to be a transformative shift to understand the benefits of CPR and protecting them for future generation. He also focused on population grounds versus life support system. Now this is a very critical issue when we talk about population and versus life support systems. Now, there are three important models of common property management. The capitalist model that talks about privatization of public resources, the socialist model that talks about nationalization of public resources for equitable strategy of resource management, and the third one, anthropological model that talks about communal system of management as the best solution. Now, what are the key issues? As we come to the end of this discussion, some of the concluding statements that I would like to leave with all of you are, first important one is existence of strong village institution, especially women that are the main player of CPRs, should not be excluded in policy matter. They should not be given a tokenistic approach to decision making. Wide variation of land tenure system makes common management policies very difficult to be adopted. Third, lack of resource inventory mapping of clan or community forest land. Fourth, lack of technical expertise available at district level to control degradation of forest land. Lack of interdepartmental collaboration efforts, especially with Department of Soil, Water, Forest Department and Agriculture Department. So consensus is one of the issues that needs to be addressed. The present management planning of forests so far has been weak, and there needs to be a subsistence and sufficient amount of improvement that Government of India is already planning, and it stresses more on protection than on production. Neglecting rich indigenous knowledge, especially on forest inventory and local ecological services, and including them in policy planning can really help better. Poor participation of communities, self-help groups, they all are needed for the preparation of government line department work plan. So these all key issues, if addressed, can benefit the larger context of conservation of community property resources or common property resources. So now, bit of issues. Why there is a resource to political organization, public goods or public bads, these are some of the issues that we need to address while managing these assets. Private solutions, the free rider problem, the potential of bureaucratic performance, the political economy of bureaucracies, decision making or bargaining costs, potential for bureaucratic performance in a common pool resources. So these are some of the things that are very much relevant for common property resources and common pool assets. I'm sure you learned a lot and you had some clarity on this concept of common pool resources, India's context with CPRs, tragedy of commons, Hardin's policies, an approach to the tragedy of commons, the statement and argument put forward by Eleanor Ostrom, and how we can solve and address the tragedies and improve management of these assets. So with the next session, we will be focusing on other topics that are relevant with this pertinent topic of CPR and how we can go better with decision making. Thank you so much.